Deborah and I have collaborated for quite a few years, going back to those days at OSTP, et cetera. And I want to thank the entire Council on Competitiveness for partnering with DOE to make this event possible, but also to make our 3-year partnership of high-level dialogue on these issues of energy, clean energy, and manufacturing competitiveness. I also want to thank Dave Danielson, head of our Efficiency Renewables program, for really being the leader on our side of the partnership, and you'll be hearing from Dave later on. Let me say that I think ultimately, the base that I see, the foundation for this agenda really lies with President Obama's climate action plan put forward in June. Of course, it emphasizes mitigation measures, which brings us to the whole need to develop and accelerate innovation and deployment in clean energy. It also elevated the role of adaptation as an important commitment going forward. That also has implications, things like how do we build our energy infrastructure out, how do we make it resilient, for example. And I would also add that the plan really does advance all of the above energy strategy of the administration, and that has implications here as well, because we are talking about energy across the entire spectrum of fuel sources. So I think, as was indicated already in opening remarks, we see the major driver of America's competitive advantage in the global market really as R&D and an unparalleled innovation ecosystem that allows us to be effective in translating R&D into new products and processes. But of course, we all know also that RD&D, research, development, demonstration, deployment, is far from a linear innovation chain. Very, very strong feedbacks all the way from the idea generation to the scale up. And of course, in the middle of all that is our manufacturing capacity. Indeed, to quote another speaker coming up, Gene Sperling likes to say how manufacturing really punches above its weight in our economy. It may be 12% of the GDP, but it has an enormous influence over our whole private R&D agenda. Now, again, at the department, I won't go into it, but we have in detail, but we have, of course, a very strong R&D program from the Office of Science to ARPA-E to our EERE, nuclear energy, fossil energy, Office of Electricity. But we are also, of course, very concerned, particularly on accelerating at that demonstration and deployment side of the innovation chain as well, because we all know that new technologies have to cross the so-called valley of death, or as Norm Augustine will probably emphasize, the valleys of death in going to scale up. One of our programs here, it's attracted a little bit of discussion, is the loan program, for example, and its various components as a way of, in fact, getting technologies that are pushing the edge out there to hopefully then get picked up and scale in the private sector. A good example of that, a very good example really, is utility scale photovoltaics. Back in 2009, there were no, let's say, 100 megawatt plus solar installations in the United States. At that time, there was also essentially no debt financing available at that period. Ironically, equity investments were available, and that's the kind of gap that the loan program went to fill. And indeed, the investments from the program were in 5 such projects, and now there are 10 projects attracting purely private financing, and that's exactly the kind of kickoff that we want to do. Turning more generally to deployment and industry competitiveness, I think we find ourselves really at a unique moment in our energy history with a very wide array of clean energy technologies at or close to cost competitiveness in many of our markets. Of course, cost competitiveness in different markets depends upon the policy structure, regulatory structures, et cetera. But there has really been a tremendous amount of progress. We put out a small report at DOE about 2 months ago called Revolution ... now, where it simply presented data on costs, data on deployment for a variety of technologies. I'll say a bit more about those. But I think the real message we were trying to put across with that is we have seen in a number of technologies the very, very dramatic cost reductions, usually in a remarkably short period, and in a 5-year time period. And I think our mindset, in some sense, needs to shift from what many viewed as these technologies always being 5 to 10 years away from competitiveness to actually they are getting into the competitive sphere. If the revolution is not full-fledged now, we are at least, I think, storming the barricades and ready to move forward. And that's why also a very important part of our focus has to be on the deployment side, on the manufacturing side, so that we can capture the full fruits of that innovation chain. Indeed, because manufacturing punches above its weight, and because the innovation chain has such strong feedback loops, that manufacturing component is very important to drive that innovation. So if we look in that context, since, say, 2008, wind has more than tripled. I think many of you know. In 2012, it was the largest capacity addition in our electricity system. Solar in that time period, a factor of 10, and just last quarter, Q3 2013, we saw nearly a gigawatt of photovoltaic deployed in this country, exceeding, for the first time, at least in a long time, for example, Germany's deployment. So again, there's a lot happening out there, seen by many in this room, but probably not so well known throughout our society's discussion. Again, manufacturing, we really need to help capture that, and today, like to announce, very pleased to announce that the Department of Energy, working with the Department of the Treasury, has awarded $150 billion in clean energy tax credits to 12 U.S. manufacturers. In fact, I think there may be some in this room from some of those companies, and if you are, I'd welcome you to stand up and give a wave. I don't know if you know who you are. There we are. There's at least one standing up, another here, and more. There we go. Excellent. So this is great, and so obviously the credit goes to these companies developing these technologies, and I just want to say that Dave Danielson will say more about this later on, talking about the program. But let me say, so these companies obviously are demonstrating their commitment to hiring new workers in the United States, reducing emissions, and with tremendous potential for innovation and deployment. I also want to emphasize that the award recipients represent what I called earlier the all of the above approach. They range from diesel emission control products made in Irwin, New York, low-head, high-flow hydro turbines made in California, eco-friendly condensing gas furnaces with at least 95% annual fuel utilization efficiency made at a plant in Indianapolis. I am half pleased to say, because of the significant capital outlay that was forced upon me and my wife, that we are right now putting in today a 96% efficient gas furnace. Again, it was an unplanned expenditure, but we're very pleased to have this high efficiency product coming into our home in Boston. So again, these come from this 48C Advanced Energy Manufacturing Tax Credit that was established in the Recovery Act, and these follow on, in fact, a larger set of awards made a few years ago that already are yielding, more wind turbines made in Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan, more efficient HVAC units made in Minnesota, et cetera. And as I said, Dave Danielson will come back and say a bit more about this program. Now, we're also, I think as many of you know, trying to advance manufacturing in other ways. Earlier this year, in 2013, the department launched the Clean Energy Manufacturing Initiative, and this is an effort, again, originating in energy efficiency and renewable energy office, but now with their leadership being expanded to a department-wide initiative. And while we, again, and this is, again, aligned with the all-of-the-above energy approach, because these manufacturing needs certainly extend to these other technologies. The 48C, again, included things like CCS, as well as wind and efficiency technologies, but also another of the programs that we certainly are emphasizing in the nuclear sphere, small modular reactors, where in fact how we establish manufacturing will be key to the success, or not, we hope to the success of that as a technology, because it will depend upon the manufacturing, quality controls, et cetera, that we can have in producing that technology. Now, the initiative has two main objectives. Obviously, to increase U.S. competitiveness in the production of our cutting-edge energy technologies and services and products, and secondly, to boost competitiveness across the board by increasing energy efficiency, energy productivity through the sector, a place where, again, we still have tremendous potential. And of course, there is another strain in our competitiveness today with our low natural gas prices, certainly relative to other places. Many of you know it's hard to count, but generally estimates of between $100 and $150 billion of additional investment in new manufacturing in this country has been facilitated by natural gas. So we have a number of advantages, a number of new directions. We partnered with the Department of Defense as a lead partner, the DoD, in establishing our prototype new Advanced Manufacturing Institute in Youngstown, Ohio, on additive manufacturing, 3D printing, if you like, and we will be announcing, we expect early in 2014, a second funded by the Department of Energy now in power electronics, and the Department of Defense moving forward as well in some other initiatives. So again, we're trying to get out there and advance manufacturing, develop the new processes, the new tools that can in fact cut across many of our clean energy and other sectors. The President has made it clear that he not only will we be advancing these institutes, but he'd like to see this scale up, in fact, into a substantially larger program because of the strong focus on manufacturing, jobs, and again, supporting the end-to-end innovation system. So another area, we are also reinforcing our support for technical assistance for manufacturers to improve energy productivity. Again, another focus on getting a competitive edge. Now, beyond manufacturing of equipment for clean energy, DOE, again, in the spirit, is really working to make all manufacturing more efficient. Another program, which is we may play a convening role, but really is carried by the private sector, as an expansion of our Better Buildings program, the so-called Better Plants program. Companies participating, advancing and sharing best practices, establishing energy productivity, energy performance baselines, setting goals, reporting on their progress towards those goals, and the goals will typically be in the vicinity of a 25% energy intensity advance over a decade. And so far, more than 120 participating companies in this program have reported nearly a 0.2 quads of energy savings over the last 3 years, and $1 billion cumulatively in energy cost savings. So again, these are all different ways of trying to do what we can, from everything from direct investment to cost-shared investment, public-private partnerships, and convening roles to advance manufacturing. In fact, last month, I had the privilege of accompanying President Obama to Cleveland, where a once shuttered steelworking plant has retooled and now makes more steel per worker than any other steel manufacturer in the world. And I might add, a major part of their customer base is the auto industry, looking for advanced steels that will fit into their advanced vehicles. In turn, an area that was greatly aided, to close the circle, backed by our loan program, where a major loan, for example, to Ford, allowed retooling in 10 states of manufacturing facilities targeted to advanced vehicles, popular models, Ford Fusions, Ford Tauruses, F-150s, et cetera. And again, this plant in Cleveland now, with high efficiency, being competitive to supply those plants. In fact, I'll mention again, still with Ford, there are GM, Chrysler are all involved in this as well. But I was just speaking earlier this week to an innovation summit in Northern Ohio, organized by Congresswoman Capter, who I think may also be here today in the program, and noted that a plant that also had been shuttered in the Cleveland area reopened, making Ford EcoBoost engines, 20% better efficiency, combining direct injection and turbocharging, and that one plant has now made a third of the 2 million EcoBoost engines that have come forward. So there's really a lot of great stories out there, and these are the kinds of things that we need to expand. As the president said at that event in Cleveland, if you're saving money on energy costs, that means you can invest in equipment, invest in workers, hire more people, produce more products, more jobs. So these are a bunch of ways in which we believe we can remain competitive in the global market. Of course, the last point I'll mention in this context for competitiveness is workforce development. Very critical. Sometimes we forget about that as an essential link in the innovation chain to support advanced manufacturing. This, of course, takes us back to the STEM agenda: science, technology, engineering, and math. And DOE is committed to student outreach. For example, thanks to funding from the DOE Advanced Manufacturing Office through the Oak Ridge National Lab manufacturing demonstration facility, where we have a 3D, again, manufacturing focus. I see the director down there, I believe, in the dark. And 400 3D printers have been made available to high school teams through the first robotics competition, the U.S. first robotics competition. Stuff is pretty cool, and I think we have one sitting out there somewhere for you to look at, along with a robot from the competition. I'll also say that another direction that we are interested in pursuing now at the college university level would be to start something that looks more like NIH traineeships for areas of need specifically throughout the clean energy space. Power electronics, I mentioned that for the Second Manufacturing Institute. A complement to that is installing things like traineeship programs so that we are producing more people from our universities skilled in that whole set of power electronics areas. So that's really kind of a tour of the horizon of how we are looking to help stimulate advanced manufacturing in this country, particularly in our case, of course, with a focus on on the energy sector. Just to repeat again, I think we feel committed to working along the entire innovation chain, R&D, D, and D, and we want to link that to a very, very strong focus on manufacturing. We want to continue to focus also on the key enablers for that, such as human capital development to support these initiatives. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention. I want to thank you for being here. And again, I want to thank the Council of Competitiveness for their tremendous partnership as we work together to advance our shared goals. So thank you very much, and wish you all the best, a great summit. Thank you.